Is it Muller or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Can hear Jacob. I cannot see Jacob, but that's okay.
It's okay. The book cover is far more beautiful. All right. Thank you everyone for your patience. Thank you, Balkan Circle. Thank you, Mary, for hosting me and for being such a great mentor to me since I've arrived at UT. I really appreciate that. So on that note, I'm only 7 months in here at UT. I completed my history PhD at Stanford in 2022. I was a lecturer there for a couple of years, and I have just arrived at UT, where I have two roles: assistant professor of instruction for Jewish studies and assistant director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies. I'm teaching courses, I'm helping run the Jewish Studies Center, and I'm very pleased to say my first book will come out in a few weeks. I've been told I get the first box of books at the end of April delivered to my home in Hyde Park. So, what can I say? I'll focus on any small reason to celebrate in these times that I can find. And I had said originally that I would sort of give a general book talk, a summary of the book and the arguments and all that. This week I thought, let me prepare something a little more tailored for this audience. So I'm gonna zoom in on some sources from this book and try to tell a story that's a little more tailored to maybe Balkanists and folks who are interested in early 20th century Southeastern Europe. But here is the book, The Jews of Edirne, the End of Ottoman Europe and the Arrival of Borders. Let's see if I can advance in my slideshow. Here we go. Great. And everyone sees the next slide, right? Did this text come up?
Yes.
Okay. While standing on one foot, this book follows one of the world's largest Sephardi Jewish communities through a tumultuous series of events that shifted the position and meaning of the border in the Edirne region. Edirne being once a central Ottoman place, and then beginning in the late 19th century and into the early 20th, a border region. And that had tremendous implications for everyone, including the Jewish community. And it's the implications for the Jewish community in particular that I focus on. And when I say a series of tumultuous events, for example, the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, which is more or less when the book begins, the Balkan Wars, 1912 to 13, Bulgaria occupies Edirne in 1913, briefly. Then, of course, World War I, which is accompanied by a series of ethnic cleansing, and in the case of the Armenian population, a genocide. Greek occupation, 1920 to 1922, the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1923, and as we'll hear about later, something called the Thrace events, or the Trakya olayları of 1934, which to this day is the only case of mob violence against Jews in the history of the Turkish Republic. So we'll see in some of the cases that I'm going to zoom in on, we'll see reflections of some of these events, but I'm not going to tell the story start to finish. Instead, I'm going to again use a set of stories from local newspapers to zoom in on the period 1908 to 1912, and then something from 1921, and then a couple articles from 1934. So let me start with some maps. I'm indebted to my friend, the artist Jem Dean Lenmish, who made these maps that appear at the beginning of my book. I think the book is worth it for the maps alone, in my opinion. The maps really tell, pictures worth 1,000 words. The maps do in just 5 images what would take me a long time to do with words, and that's just show you how the border closes in on Edirne and moves. So 1877, on the eve of the Russo-Ottoman War, that dotted line is just the provincial border of Edirne province. You can't even see the borders with Russia or Austria-Hungary. The only state border you can see is with Greece in the southwest. 1908, two important events for our purposes happened that year: the Young Turk Revolution and Bulgaria's declaration of independence from the Ottoman Empire. It had been de facto independent, but de jure not until 1908, and that certainly changes the meaning of this border between the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. 1915, after both the Balkan Wars and a deal struck between the Ottomans and the Bulgarians for Bulgaria to enter World War I, this is the new border. You can see it closing in on the city of Edirne, sort of almost wrapping around it there. And I'll add the image we use to represent Edirne on this map is a Selimiye Mosque, which was completed in 1575 and was and continued to be the largest mosque in the Ottoman Empire. 1920, after Greece's annexation of the Thrace region, that's a term Thrace is often used to describe this region. Edirne and the surrounding area become part of northeastern Greece. In fact, I'll say occupied sometimes. I'll use both words, occupation, annexation. But in fact, according to Athens, at least, this was part of Greece for 2 years, as this map shows. Istanbul was not part of Greece. So Edirne is actually cut off from Istanbul according to the map. And 1923, after the founding of the Turkish Republic, this is more or less the map that we see today, where Edirne remains a border town every now and then. When there's a border incident involving immigrants, like, and Edirne will be in the news for a hot minute, and you'll see some issues, some images of a border incident, usually involving migrants trying to enter the EU, Bulgaria or Greece, both EU member states, from Turkish Edirne. So it's a tri-point. Turkey, Bulgaria, and Greece all meet at this one point outside Edirne today. Okay, and by the way, here is an image taken recently from another friend of mine in Greece. This is Selimiye Mosque, Edirne as seen from Greece, from the highway in Greece. So that's how close it is. And as I say in my book, when Selim II built his namesake mosque in Edirne, he could never have imagined it would be embellishing the view for people in a foreign country. This was at a time when the Ottoman Empire pressed deep into Europe to the gates of Vienna. But now you can see his mosque from Greece. So here's what I am going to talk about today. I'll call this talk Reporting Across Borders, Sephardi Jews and Interstate Comparisons in the Balkan Press, 1908 to 1934. So looking at newspaper articles written in Ladino, Ottoman Turkish, Bulgarian, and Greek, we'll see how journalists in the Edirne region wrote about places and events just across the border in a shared or sometimes contested attempt to determine the meaning of that line. And as we just saw on those maps, the state border or state borders, plural, only appeared in this region during the first decades of the 20th century. It was a new presence in people's lives. And I'll say right off the bat, quick disclaimer, my research languages include Ladino, Turkish, Ottoman, and modern. I don't read Greek or Bulgarian, but I was able to access a few articles in those languages thanks to friends or translations that I found in the Ottoman archive. Okay, so let's begin in 1908. Again, any historian of Turkey or the Ottoman Empire will tell you this is the year of the Young Turk Revolution, and perhaps less famously among Ottomanists, but maybe as important, it's the year of Bulgaria's declaration of independence from the Ottoman Empire, which is a very sort of controversial event among residents of Edirne province. So what that means is that suddenly this border between these two events of 1908, this border now separates two constitutional monarchies. So in this context, let's compare an article from an Ottoman Turkish newspaper in Plovdiv, Bulgaria, Filibe in Turkish, or Filipopoli in Greece. We'll look at that, and then we'll look at an article from a Ladino newspaper in Edirne from roughly the same time period. Both writers made sort of cross-border comparisons. They compare the situation on both sides of the border in ways that are remarkably similar, I think we'll see. So we'll start with Balkan Gazetesi, Balkan newspaper published in Plovdiv by Edhem Ruhi from 1906 to 1908. Edhem Ruhi was a leader of the Young Turk opposition who fled the Ottoman Empire in 1900. By 1906, he was living in Plovdiv as a Bulgarian citizen and publishing this Turkish language, this Ottoman Turkish newspaper, Balkan. So on the eve of the Young Turk Revolution in early July 1908, he wrote an interesting article called Sobrania da Negordum, What I Saw in the Bulgarian National Assembly. Here he claims that Bulgaria, first of all, is more politically and socially advanced than the Ottoman Empire, his homeland. More interesting, though, is how he attributes this fact. He attributed this divergence not to essential differences between Bulgarian-speaking Christians and Turkish-speaking Muslims, but to Bulgaria's adoption of a constitution. During the 6 centuries in which Bulgarian and Turkish speakers had lived under one state, the Ottoman Empire, neither group had become more advanced than the other, according to our author. Furthermore, many Bulgarian Christians continued to live on the Ottoman side of the border, and many Turkish Muslims, including Ruhi himself, lived on the Bulgarian side. For Ruhi, then the border between Plovdiv and Edirne did not separate 2 races or ethnic groups, but rather 2 systems of government, one constitutional, the other absolutist, on the eve of the Young Turk Revolution. 2 years later, in 1910, in 1910, a Sephardi Jew named Joseph Bar Yitzchak started a Ladino newspaper in Edirne, on the Ottoman side of the border. The newspaper was called La Voz de la Verdad, the voice of truth. In addition to Ladino, Bar Yitzchak knew French, Hebrew, Bulgarian, and Turkish. In fact, his newspaper often responded to pieces that appeared in the local Ottoman Turkish press. In September 1912, so this is 4 years after Ruhi's article that I quoted, and right before the outbreak of the First Balkan War, though no one knew it at the time, Bar Yitzchak took the train to Plovdiv and immediately published his reflections on the trip for his Jewish readers in Edirne. The newspaper had Jewish subscribers all over the Balkans, it's worth mentioning, but most of them are in Edirne. First, he described how much prettier Plovdiv had become since his last visit. The wide streets and attractive storefronts made a strong impression on, quote, that traveler who, a few hours earlier, had left the city of Edirne, where, except for one street, everything is but a mass of miserable-looking buildings, end quote. Why, he asked, were the Ottomans so far behind the Bulgarians? Quote, is it that the Ottoman people, which, by the way, in Ladino, pueblo ottomano, is it that the Ottoman people do not want to sacrifice the money to beautify and clean up the city in which they dwell? Why have we Ottomans let ourselves fall behind a people that, not long ago, was still an integral part of our great empire? What is the cause of this inertia, this apathy of ours? Are we not made of the same clay? Do we not have the same sentiments? I hope you'll agree, here we see an unmistakable echo of Ruhi's logic. There's no doubt that Bar Yitzchak, was up to speed with the Ottoman Turkish press. I think what both men are saying, only 34 years prior, Edirne and Plovdiv had been Ottoman cities, and many families continued to count members in both places. The differences between these 2 cities simply reflected the different political regimes under which they had come to exist. In Bulgaria, according to Bar Yitzchak, quote, the entire population, even in the villages, has received a civic education, which allows people to assess current events and exercise their right of popular sovereignty. This last phrase was not understood in the Ottoman Empire, where it was commonly believed that, quote, paying taxes to the country in money or blood provides only for the needs of state functionaries, never for the needs of the people, end quote. In Bulgaria, civic education among the general Bulgarian people, pueblo bulgaro, had taught the Jews to become active, responsible citizens. This had alleviated anti-Semitism, antisemitismo, to use the Ladino press's word, and caused everyone to regard the Jews as, quote, true Bulgarians. While the reinstatement of the constitution, so now we're after the October Revolution, while the reinstatement of the constitution had been a step in the right direction for the Ottoman Empire, there was still much progress to be made. So that's Joseph Bar Yitzchak's take, writing in La Voz de la Verdad in 1912. I'll switch to another different Ladino newspaper called Hashofar. In comparing the Jewish communities of Edirne and Plovdiv, Bar Yitzchak was continuing a tradition of the Ladino press in which readers were urged to either emulate or avoid the behavior of Jews in other towns. Ladino travelogues tended to describe either good Jews or bad Jews, so to speak. An example of the deeply didactic function of Jewish newspapers in the Balkans. The journalists, the writers saw themselves as the modernized educators of their readers and took it upon themselves to sort of teach them in whatever they viewed as good and modern. And what exactly was deemed good and modern depended, as we'll see in a second. So for a variety of reasons that perhaps we can discuss later in the Q&A, the first Balkan Jewish community to openly embrace Zionism was that of Bulgaria. By 1901, the Zionist Organization of Bulgaria was publishing a Ladino newspaper called Hashofar in Plovdiv. And here's the masthead. But the newspaper's commitment to Zionism, which was long on platitudes, somewhat short on substance, did not stop it from continuing certain traditions of the Ladino press. For example, it continued to make didactic comparisons between good and bad, put those words in quotes, good and bad Jewish communities. Only now the criteria involved levels of local Zionist development, where for Bar Yitzchak, the criteria involved, levels of sort of being modern along the lines set out by, we can say, like Western European Jewish modernizers. So in this article from Hashofar that I'm going to talk about, was written by editor-in-chief Behor Azaria. It's not the article, not the image you see here, by the way. In 1909, Azaria traveled from Plovdiv to Edirne after Jewish leaders in Edirne canceled a gymnastics exhibition that was supposed to be performed by Plovdiv's Maccabi Club. Maccabi was and still is a Zionist athletic organization founded by German Jews in Istanbul in the late 19th century. So after Azaria's trip, he returns to Plovdiv, and a week later, he published a series of articles describing his visit in Ladino for his readers. In Edirne, he said, quote, "There are anti-Zionists who terrorize the Jews with a fear that if they become Zionists, they will be slaughtered like the Armenians. Naturally, this mass of people cannot make use of the Constitution when it does not even understand it." The slaughter was a reference to the massacre of Ottoman Armenians committed in the 1890s under the reign of Abdul Hamid. And by anti-Zionists, Azaria was referring to directors of the local Jewish schools in Edirne, the people who had canceled the original Maccabi event, in fact. These schools were affiliated with the Alliance Israélite Universelle, an organization based in Paris that ran a vast network of Jewish schools stretching from Morocco to Iran. The Alliance opposed Zionism on the grounds that it might hinder the project of integrationism. The Alliance wanted Jews to become better citizens in the places where they lived. And that worldview was shared by the school directors. By the way, most of these school directors, including in Edirne, are local Ottoman Jews. They're not sent from Paris. They're from Istanbul or other Ottoman cities. In his article series, Azaria listed the various Jewish associations that he found in Edirne, noting which ones were friendly and which ones hostile to Zionist ideals. It's like a bit of a report card. He described a speech that he gave to an enthusiastic audience, despite opposition by some local Jewish leaders. In fact, the director of the Alliance school broke up his speech at one point, said, "You can't give the speech here. This venue is owned by the Alliance, and they had to reschedule it for another venue later in the day where the speech continued. According to him, it was met with great applause. And in fact, Azaria concludes his article series by saying that his speech inspired some attendees to form Edirne's first Zionist association. I'm skeptical of this claim, as I found no other mention of that society. By and large, Edirne Jews remained wary of Zionism at this time, although that will change. I'm going to jump ahead 11 or 12 years, but staying with the theme of Zionist journalists traveling across the border to Edirne. So between 1909 and 1920, the borders of Southeastern Europe would change radically. The style of the Ladino Zionist press would not. As we will see, the Jews of Edirne continued to be shamed by Zionists visiting from across the border, even if the border was not the same one, or have not even existed back in 1909. So you'll see Istanbul on this map. It says occupied by the Allies in 1920, but it's still part of the Ottoman Empire, what's left of the Ottoman Empire. And you'll see a border separating the greater Istanbul region from what is now Greece. And Edirne and the Edirne region is in northeastern Greece. Unlike Izmir, by the way, the Greek occupation of Izmir, aka Smyrna, is far more famous. In fact, the Greeks never fully annexed it, but they did annex the Edirne region. So a journalist from Istanbul named David El-Nakabeh worked for the Zionist Federation of the East and edited its newspaper El Judio, the Jew. In the summer of 1921, he obtained special permission. Speaking of special permission, you still need administrative privileges, yes. Okay.
Yes, we do.
In the summer of 1921, he obtained special permission from the Greek authorities to take the train from Istanbul to Eastern Thrace, as the Edirne region had come to be called. Eastern Thrace as opposed to Western Thrace, which is, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but is well around Komotini would be Western Thrace, for example.
Who is this that got permission?
So David El-Nakabeh, it's spelled El-Nakabeh, Elnekave.
Not Maccabee.
El-Nakabeh. El-Nakabeh worked for the Zionist Federation of the East in Istanbul and edited its newspaper El Judio. And he, in the summer of 1921, obtained special permission from the Greek authorities to take the train from Istanbul to this region that is now called Eastern Thrace. There he hoped to collect payment for the Zionist newspapers, El Judio, that he had sent unsolicited to Jews of the region. Though he claimed the trip was, quote, exclusively for business purposes, El-Nakabeh was also checking on the progress of local Zionist clubs. On that score, results were mixed. In many Jewish communities, El-Nakabeh encountered nothing but, quote, egoism, materialism, and people whose, quote, only God is money. These were common insults or criticisms that Zionists in the region would throw at those deans, not being sufficiently idealistic and selfless for the Zionist cause. Chorlu, she's not on this map. Chorlu's near Tekirdağ. Chorlu alone received high marks, as that town led the region in contributions to the Jewish National Fund. The city of Edirne ranked somewhere in the middle. According to El-Nakabeh, the community was, quote, in decline and riven by internal disputes, including a debate over the proposed hiring of two, quote unquote, well-paid Hebrew teachers. Debates about, to what extent Hebrew should be taught in local schools were fierce at this time. But according to El-Nakabeh, the community in Edirne maintained a moderate level of Zionist activity and was, quote, well treated by the Greek administration. In fact, by the last year of the Greek occupation, by 1922, the Jews of Edirne did begin to embrace Zionism, or at least Zionist representations. It's hard to say what exactly Zionism meant to Jews in this part of the world at this time. There's not a lot of deep ideology or even talking about moving to Palestine. Sephardi Jews often the line for them, the line between diaspora nationalism, a sort of Jewish nationalism in the place where Jews live, that advocates for more autonomy. The line between that and Zionism proper involving a Jewish state in Palestine, it's a blurry line, and it's not often clear. But whatever they meant by it, Zionism is discussed at length in local Jewish newspapers. It's discussed positively. There are Zionist clubs, and the Jewish quote national flag is flown at certain ceremonies. That's almost certainly a reference to what is today the flag of the state of Israel, was at the time the flag of the Zionist movement. For example, when the British Mandate for Palestine was ratified in the summer of 1922, thousands of people crammed into the great synagogue of Edirne to celebrate. Young members of the new Maccabi Sports Club, so now there is a Maccabi club in Edirne. These boys and girls wore their blue and white uniforms, and the Jewish orphanage brass band played the Greek national anthem, followed by Hatikva. Now here we are in 1923. That situation would change drastically and quickly. When the Greek occupation ended a few months later, so did the Jewish community's brief flirtation with Zionism. Greece, not to mention Bulgaria, largely approved of Zionism, which was seen as a fellow nationalist movement fighting for secession from the Ottoman Empire. For similar reasons, the Turkish Republic vehemently opposed this movement. During the first decade of the Turkish Republic, so from 1923 to 1933, the Jews of Edirne experienced pressure to assimilate in the cultural realm and resentment and exclusion in the economic realm. Still, this was a relatively peaceful time compared to the period 1912 to 1922, which again was characterized by war and ethnic cleansing. Not ethnic cleansing of Jews, by the way, but nevertheless, a very violent, scary time for the local Jewish community. But from 1923 to 1933, the Jews of Edirne successfully lived as minority citizens on the Turkish border. So things weren't always kumbaya, but largely peaceful. And it's this. We face this situation that we often see for Jewish communities in the 19th and early 20th century. It's this this sort of double-edged sword where the Jews of Edirne are relatively successful, economically speaking, vis-a-vis their non-Jewish neighbors. In fact, attempts to sort of evict or expel the Christian population and create a Muslim bourgeoisie, and it sort of backfired or hit a snag when it was often Jews who would fill those economic roles left behind by the departing Christians. This created resentment among some voices, which we see reflected in the local Turkish press. So, but nevertheless, it sort of depends how you want to look at this. It's all, we can also say that it's a time where Jews are living, experiencing a degree of economic success. I mean, relative to their neighbors. Visiting international Jewish organizations described how horribly poor the Jewish community was. We have to keep this, we have to use our frame of reference here. But the Jews lived mostly peacefully and with some degree of economic success. But in the summer of 1934, after an official from the Turkish government toured the region and met privately with local leaders, the Jews of Eastern Thrace were attacked by their neighbors in a week of violence that prompted a Jewish exodus from the borderland, but killed no Jews, interestingly. It's mostly looting, people being beat up, There are mixed accounts as to whether or not rape occurred. In any case, Jews were terrorized and robbed, and many left the region, mostly to Istanbul, by the way, not across the border, but to Istanbul. They didn't flee the country, they fled the borderland. The so-called Thrace events, Thracia or they remain the only case of mob violence against Jews in the history of the Turkish Republic. Coverage of the events in the Turkish press is a topic for another day. Here, I'd like to discuss how they were covered across the border in Greece and Bulgaria. Let's begin with the Evros prefecture of Greece, which runs along Greece's northeast border. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor here, but Didymotiko, for example, is in Evros. The region's major newspaper was called Prodos, Progress. It was published in Alexandroupoli, which is south of Didymotiko. It's on the Aegean. It's a port city. And it aligned with the Liberal Party of former Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos. Shortly before the anti-Jewish attacks broke out in the summer of 1934, the Turkish legislature in Ankara passed a vaguely written settlement law that seemed to give the state powers to relocate minority citizens, especially in sensitive regions, geopolitically sensitive regions. Under the headline, "Let's imitate our neighbor," a writer for Prodos in Greece urged Athens to follow Ankara's example. The Greek legislature, said the writer, should pass a law that would facilitate the removal of Jews from Greece's northeastern borderland. Interesting, there's debate about whether or not the Turkish settlement law was passed toward the end of removing Jews from the Edirne region. I mean, the official line is no, that's not what it was for. But interesting that folks on the Greek side of the border understood that that's what it was for. This Greek journalist definitely understands that to be the purpose of it. I think that's great, and thinks that Greece should pass similar legislation. When anti-Jewish pogroms swept Turkish Thrace 2 weeks later, Prodos complained not about the violence, but about the influx of Jews it had caused into Greece. The newspaper claimed that the Greek border town of Nea Orestiada, had been, quote, overrun by Turkish Jews to the point that, quote, today it looks like a Jewish town, end quote. It urged the police to prevent further settlement there and to monitor Jews in the region. Now, let's move to Bulgaria. Admittedly, I don't have anything from the border region, southern Bulgaria, but I did find a fascinating article from Slovo in Sofia. Again, I don't read Bulgarian, but I found a French translation of this article in the Ottoman archive. I read French.
Slovo is, the title is Word.
Word. Thank you. Slovo, word. So again, this is shortly after the attacks against Jews in the summer of 1934. Commenting on the Thrace events, the Bulgarian newspaper wrote, quote, "What could be the pretext for the sudden persecution of Jewish masses? Peaceful and loyal people who are not suspected of any sort of irredentism. One cannot say that they sing the hymn of Saint Sophia, even in spirit. One cannot claim that they have links to some non-extant Thracian organization that threatens the territorial integrity of the Turkish Republic by organizing speeches in a Stranja village populated by refugees from Thrace, that is, from Ottoman or Turkish Thrace." In other words, I think this writer is saying, if Bulgarian speakers in Turkish Thrace had been unfairly accused of harboring foreign sympathies by the Turks, such claims were even more chimerical when it came to Jews. Between the lines, the author was commenting on the expulsion of Bulgarians from Ottoman Edirne that had occurred during the Balkan Wars, so almost 20 years prior. And what he's saying, I think, is that this latest expulsion of Jews from the region, another ethno-religious minority being expelled from the borderland, sort of proves a deep-seated intolerance on the part of Bulgaria's southern neighbor. So let me conclude, because I want to leave time for questions. I see we're at a quarter of. These are very different stories, different time periods, but I claim what they share, what these writers share is an effort to determine the meaning of the border. And I'm using the word determine intentionally. It's conveniently vague for me. Determine in the sense of understand, but also to maybe create its meaning. We see writers trying to determine the meaning of the border, the identities it could and could not generate, and the violence it could and could not legitimate. Thank you, and I'll leave time for questions.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting and a fascinating look at, again, a region that is near and dear to us for all things Balkan and through its different stages. And of course, it is always fascinating to look through the original sources that you build your argument upon, and I'm very glad that there are multiple sources being cited to provide a balanced view. And what I would start the discussion and then, open it is, what's your impression, and the sources that you've been looking at, especially on this issue about viewing Zionism, in Bulgaria versus Turkey? How radically different were those, views of community that shares, more or less ties, which regardless of the liminality and the meaning of border, because I think your book actually speaks about this larger idea about how should we think about borders on the Balkans and competing nationalisms and so on. But this is something that I've taken as a note, to start up the discussion, which is interesting to me.
Great, thank you. I'll address this now.
Yes, please.
I think that observation is right on. Can people see me, by the way?
Yes, Tatiana says yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Tatiana.
Yeah. I think that observation is right on. The border, there's someone, this is a quote from a scholar named Manlio Graziano. He says something along the lines like, borders mean different things for different people. A border is not the same thing for everyone. And that line can mean a lot of different things. The way I use that line, in terms of the history at hand, the borders that are developing around Edirne at this time don't necessarily affect, say, Muslims, Christians, Jews in the same way. Bulgarians, Greeks, Armenians, Sephardi Jews, Turkish-speaking Muslims. It affects different groups differently. And in the case of the Jewish community, in terms of their cultural identity, I think they remain somewhat resistant to seeing the border as anything more than a political divide between two states. None of the states claim, to be Jewish. None of the states claim, none of these nation states claim that the nation, right, is the Jewish nation. And the Jews, I think, are slower to adapt that notion. I mean, you can phrase it positively or negatively. You can say they're slower to adapt this modern notion of identifying with your nation state, or you can say they resist this, potentially dark tendency of this sort of ethno-national system. In any case, they maintain strong links across that Ottoman Bulgarian border. And it's pretty clear that their community, right, like the old Jewish millet, the ethno-religious community that was their source of identity through much of Ottoman history, that persists, and it persists across these new borders. In terms of their identity and even their social world, and often even economic partnerships, these overlook and go past the border for a surprisingly long time. What's interesting, though, however, we can't deny the fact that you see Zionism on the north side of the line, and you don't see it on the south side of the line.
Yes.
Stark. I mean, so it's not like borders don't matter at all, or borders don't do anything.
This is a fascinating fact,
Right.
you know, I mean, this
Right.
is such a short distance, in
Right.
fact.
Right, and it's stark. I mean, Zionism is very popular north of the line.
Mhm.
I'm talking now. Let's just say like 1908 to 1912. I mean, especially
Mhm.
before the Young Turk Revolution. I mean, you can't even say the word Zionism in the Ottoman Empire. I mean, exaggerating a little bit. After the Young Turk Revolution, it's complicated. The word is bandied about. You can say it, but you have to be clear about what you do and don't mean by it.
Mhm.
And even then, in the period after the Young Turk Revolution, the Jews of Edirne, even compared to Istanbul,
Mhm.
are, and even compared to Salonika,
Mhm.
they're pretty careful not to get too carried away with Zionism, whether that's because of
Is that a political strategy?
whether it's a political strategy or ideological beliefs. It's hard to say. It must have something to do with their situation by the border,
Mhm.
and they live in a place where sort of these ideas connecting nation to territory
Mhm.
are not to be bandied about and taken too lightly.
Mhm.
Not too long ago, Bulgarian Christians talking about a Bulgarian identity and Bulgarian nationalism created a new country that put a new border in Edirne's backyard. I think there's an understanding of like the potential consequences of some of these ideas. It's where I think it's Zionism for many, a minority of, but many Istanbul and Salonika Jews is an energizing, sort of exciting
Mhm.
idea. And I think the Jews of Edirne are a little more careful about
Cautious.
it. Yeah, they're cautious about it. They're thinking, they're a little more circumspect, thinking about the ways that this could go or be interpreted by their neighbors. Whereas in Bulgaria, in a country that exists by thanks to an Ottoman millet identity that turned into an Ottoman secessionist movements, right? That climate was friendlier to Zionism. The Bulgarian authorities didn't really have a problem with Zionism. They even saw a bit of a kindred spirit in Zionism. And partly as a result, it flourished. So I think for Jews in this corner of Europe, borders don't do much in terms of their zone of belonging culturally, but they have great consequences in terms of, say, the political language that you can and can't use.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because in terms of whether you live in a constitutional parliamentary state
Mhm.
or not, right? So borders, it's a little more cut and dry. It's kind of simple. Borders separate political systems. They separate which government you're subject to, which obviously will affect your range of choices in many ways. And so there we see an importance of borders. In terms of cultural identity and zone of belonging, the borders really looked beyond by Jews and Swedes.
Understood. And just a second one, you know, if possible, have you detected in the sources?
Yeah.
Because you're talking about Sephardim,
Yeah.
right, you know, mainly. But you know, other populations such as Romaniotti
Yeah.
or other, you know, Jewish groups, which might not be immediately the one. Obviously, the region, you know, there is a minority of Ashkenazim,
Yeah.
which is not very prevalent. But still, you know, is there something that you have been able to spot in the archives, if you will?
Yeah. So the Romaniot population in Edirne had been absorbed into the Sephardi population
Okay.
long ago. There's not really a distinct Romaniot population by this time.
Okay.
Unlike the case in, say, like Yanina
Mm-hmm.
in Greece, where the Romaniot population existed until the Holocaust. The Sephardi, the arrival of the Sephardim
Mm-hmm.
after 1492, they really become, their culture comes to dominate that of other Jewish groups, whether it be Ashkenazi or Romaniot.
Mm-hmm.
And Sephardi culture is the Jewish culture of Edirne, and Ladino is the Jewish language of Edirne by the early 20th century.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much for
yeah.
making, you know, clarity on this point. Mary?
Let's let Tatiana Consign answer or ask her
Yes.
question first, and then I have questions too, but go ahead, Tatiana.
Yeah, hi. It's really fascinating, Jake. And those maps are amazing. I will buy
Yeah.
the book just for the maps.
Yes, excellent. Those are the artwork is just nice.
I'll pass that on to Jim.
Um, so I thought really fascinating what you just said about Zionism, about the sort of the care around or you're being careful about ideas about territory and nation. Like also considering that the state authorities clearly are also willing to act right on these claims, and then you have the ethnic cleansing campaigns. Um, but you also mentioned that when Palestine becomes a British mandate, that there were celebrations in Edirne,
Yeah.
and which even with the Balfour Declaration, also right during World War One, like there are all these like kind of spontaneous celebrations all over the Jewish world that are it's a mix of both, old kind of longings for the land of Israel mixed with maybe some Zionist feeling, we don't know, right? But it's clearly like there are many different things going on in those celebrations. But I'm wondering not so much about Jewish identity, but about the perceptions of their non-Jewish neighbors in terms of over time, like going from um, you know, World War One, right? Jews sort of being aligned with the Allies, and not Jews, the Jews, right?
Mhm.
Um, and then, in sort of the post World War One memory, right? The Jews are still they've shown themselves as sort of disloyal. I mean,
Mhm.
the Jews. And if
Yeah.
that then really problematizes these local communities, never mind whatever, right? It
Yeah.
problematizes their position on the border.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. That actually gets me to a point that I didn't get a chance to make in the talk. So absolutely, right? Like every time there's a change in sovereignty, obviously it's a tense moment for everyone, but the Jews included, because um, often, right, the Jews will be accused of being disloyal.
Mhm.
And you'll see this, for example, when the Turkish Republic, when Turkey sort of takes or retakes the region from Greece in the end of 1922. In the beginning, there are some articles in the Turkish press about how the Jews were sort of like in bed with the Greeks and were disloyal and all this. Ironically, during this decade, 1912 to 1922, where like the master of the realm keeps changing, the Jews of Edirne learn that the safest bet is Zionism. Like, because they don't know who will be in charge tomorrow. So obviously they
It's
have
like a hedging strategy.
it's a hedging strategy.
Assimilation's not a good idea. When
They
you
don't, I mean,
know.
obviously they have to be
Yeah.
nice, and they have to obey and do these ceremonies of friendship with whoever conquers. You obviously these ceremonies are very interesting. Whenever a new conqueror comes in, like the first week, each community sends their head rabbi, their head priest to welcome the conqueror in some elaborate ceremony. And so obviously they have to participate in all that. They have to be good, but you don't want to be too good, because then you can be accused of being traitors by the next conqueror. And Zionism, I think, becomes a good hedging strategy.
Mhm.
And I think that's among the reasons why there are several reasons why Zionist representations arise during the Greek period, 1920 to 1922. But one of them, I think, is that it's seen as a safe bet. The Jews of Edirne don't really know what's going to happen next, who's going to be in charge next. And it's better to be for Jewish nationalism than to be, overly Greek. And then that could come back to bite them later. And in a way, it sort of works. I mean, they get accused of being pro-Greek anyway in the early days of Turkish Republic, but those accusations eventually fade, and I think their focus on being, pro-Jewish during the Greek period did help after 1923.
But can I just follow up? Sorry. So in Czechoslovakia, uh, part of the usefulness of precisely this strategy, which they also use, like it's this kind of neutral position, right? What was really key about that, though, was that, by 1918, by the end of the war, the Zionist movement, international Zionist movement, is aligned with the Allies, with the winning party, while during World War One, they had been aligned more with the German Empire, right?
Mm.
And
Right.
and I just sort of wonder, in sort of going from 1922 forward, right? When really the British Mandate is part of the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, if people can no longer ignore that sort of,
Yeah.
sort of the foreignness, right? The Jews' sort of potential association with this disloyalty on a sort of international stage.
That's a great point. Yeah, I mean, right, for a number of reasons, right? Zionism is no longer a neutral strategy in Turkey after 1922. That's a great point. I mean, not only is Zionism associated with dismembering the Ottoman Empire, but as you point out, it's associated with the Allies. So there are many forces making Zionism, not an acceptable option. In 1923 and afterwards in Turkey. And I wonder, I mean, this is something I have to think more about. I wonder if the Jews at all regretted overly emphasizing Zionism, but my guess is that still, right? Like it was still better to emphasize to wave the Jewish flag from 1920 to 1922 than to wave the Greek flag. But both would be things that they get attacked for after 1922, but probably it was better to wave the Jewish flag than the Greek flag, despite the associations between Zionism and the Allies, as you point out.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
This is just such a rich topic and it's just like my brain's going crazy. But with all these border changes
Yeah.
through this really unstable time,
Yeah.
just how a city or a population kind of weather those changes. And I was thinking in particular about, I guess what you were saying about Jews of Bulgaria as
Yeah.
opposed to Greece or Turkey.
Yeah.
And for all three of those contexts, it seems to me that I was thinking about just other minority populations and how there's a little bit of a hierarchy of how they're treated or which ones, a hierarchy of threat, I would say. And the Greeks, Turks, and Bulgarians had such a triangle of hatred.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where for the Bulgarians, the Greeks and Turks were so much more of a threat and embedded in their kind of nationalist idea of these two groups oppressed us.
Mhm.
And then the Greeks had their issues with Bulgarians and Turks,
Mhm.
and Turks, had their issues with Bulgarians and Greeks.
Mhm.
And so within that, the Jewish population was seen as loyal, not a problem. And to some respect, I would say you could say about all three, maybe certain periods of time, others less so. But so thinking of that sort of, I guess, hierarchy, how they fit into other minority relationships and how that actually provided sort of cover for them, especially in Bulgaria. That, and then also.
How they fit into other minority do you mean minority relationships?
No, I mean, the state is
Yeah.
much more focused on another one,
Yeah.
even.
There
with-
are others.
Yes,
Yeah, like
even with the
front
resettlement
perception.
law, Jeanette,
Yeah.
were put in the chat, that actually the Kurdish population was the
Yeah.
real issue that they
Yeah.
were trying to deal with that kind of removal law. So, if there's someone else that's a problem, then
Right.
that population
Right.
is sort of not
Right.
the focus
Right.
of those, and in fact, they can become an ally
Yeah.
in a different kind of way.
Yeah.
So that's one question.
Yeah.
Then one other one that may or may not be related is within those communities, there's different sort of directions that those communities can go politically and
Yeah.
culturally.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's multiple directions, but one is kind of between sort of embracing modernist movements of some one kind or another, whether they're assimilationist, whether they're Zionist, and then the other is kind of digging into tradition, in a different kind of way.
Mhm.
And I know at least like for the Turkish population of Bulgaria, they were much more open to the traditionalists for a long time, because if you were gonna be a modernist, that meant you were Kemalist and a threat.
Right.
So they prefer just like traditional Muslims. And I'm just wondering if there was like for Jews, if there that same kind of like, sort of between more modernist and non-modern, like not seeing the community as one sort of lump,
Yeah.
but whether the community, I mean, you already talked about sort of Zionism was viewed differently, but that just seems like adds a layer to the way that the community's treated in three different places over time by different regimes. So the Ottoman regime might have favored one thing,
Mm.
whereas the modern Turkish regime favored another, but just, I don't know, it was just kind of occurring to me that that was an interesting way to think about it too, so
Great.
those are my questions.
Thank you. Okay, the first question about Jews not being the only other is key to Ottoman Jewish history and specifically in this period. I sort of alluded to the fact that between 1912 and 1913, horrible decade in this region where pretty much ethnic cleansing is being done to everyone except the local Jews. For once, right? There are Turkish-speaking Muslims who are being violently expelled from the Balkans, like in a southeastern direction. Bulgarian and Greek Christians at various points are being forced out of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and there's the Armenian genocide, which does reach Edirne. Even though it had supposedly started because of events on the Eastern Front of World War I, the Armenians of Edirne are sent to the Syrian desert to die as well. The Jews, through this whole period, which we can extend to the Greek-Turkish population exchange at the end of the Greco-Turkish War, Jews largely don't experience this sort of ethnic cleansing or forced deportation. And what changes, I mean, I think one reason, one of the questions of the book is like, how did the Jews like survive the most violent time period only to be expelled from this region in peacetime? And part of it is that after 1923, there were no others left in the Edirne region because Christians had basically been completely expelled. It's a slight exaggeration, but by and large. Jews are the only minority left in a politically sensitive borderland. And that's a recipe for persecution. And so one thing I say, I mean, it's not like a deep-seated cultural anti-Semitism as much as it's these borderland factors and being the only minority that really spells the end of the community. And then, exacerbated by the fact that among certain Turkish Muslim commentators, the Jews had sort of filled the economic roles that the departing Christians had left. And now it was the Jews who were sort of preventing the flourishing of a Muslim bourgeoisie. And about, the resettlement law, this is very interesting. I mean, it is important to bring Kurds into the discussion. There's some debate about this. I mean, to be clear, just big picture, just, to give you all a context, I mean, what's happening to Kurds in Turkey at this time, where we have like massacres, is beyond compared to Jews being expelled from Edirne, where in fact 0 Jews were killed. It's two very different things. It's interesting to take a close look at the resettlement law. Some say it was designed with Kurds in mind in the East. An article from a couple years ago by a scholar named Ramazan Hakkı Öztan argues that it was actually written with the Jews of Thrace in mind. That there was a draft written in 1932 with Kurds in mind. That's clear.
Mhm.
Everyone agrees on that. But the geopolitical situation changed a lot over the next 2 years. Bulgaria became more menacing in the eyes of the Turkish Republic, and the new draft that was written and passed in 1934 was written with the Jews of Edirne in mind, says Ostan, and I'm inclined to believe his argument. But yes, it's important to bring Kurds into the discussion. Interestingly, also, again, this is not. I want to be clear. I'm not doing like victim Olympics or something, or I'm not comparing. I'm not comparing levels of victimhood. I'm just looking at different types. The way different minorities are treated is interesting. I'm just pointing out like differences, not ranking. It's interesting that many of the Kurdish leaders who were evicted from Eastern Turkey to like break up some of these tribes or groups, they were in many cases, or in several cases, sent to the Edirne region around this time. So at the very moment that the Jews of Edirne are being unofficially evicted, actually Kurdish leaders are coming in. The Turkish government is settling Kurds in this region because it wasn't sensitive to have Kurds on the Bulgarian border. It was sensitive to have Kurds on the Iraqi border or the Syrian border. But it was seen arguably as sensitive to have Jews on the border with Bulgaria. This could be some warped version of what I just said, that there were Jewish networks that extended into Bulgaria, Ladino-speaking cultural communities, and it could, maybe a sort of paranoid understanding of that that led to the Turkish leaders seeing Jews as dangerous in that region. In terms of like intra-communal dynamics and the modern versus traditional thing, so you don't really, by this point, largely thanks to the Alliance schools, most, when I'll say everyone in quotes, but like everyone was modern. Like the debates among at least those with a voice, the voices that are preserved in the records, most of the leaders have been to the Alliance schools. No matter what camp you're in. It's not so much a modern versus traditional debate. The debates largely break in the late Ottoman period. They break along the lines of to what extent should Jews pursue assimilation and acculturation and integration versus to what extent should Jews try to preserve communal autonomy. Arguably, we could call the latter traditional in some way. But it's really taking the traditional millet structure and updating it and giving it facelift and giving it describing it with some modern terms. So that's probably the strongest intracommunal debate that we see. I mean, for example, there's a very interesting event in 1910. The Jews skirmish with the Ottoman police, and there's even a shootout between the Ottoman authorities demolish a building owned by a local Jew, and the Jews.
That's another name, right?
In Edirne, in the Jewish quarter, the Jews protest, and the chief of police starts calling them slurs. It escalates, and the Jews and the Ottoman police are shooting at each other. Somehow, no one is killed. And the interesting part is how the Jewish community responds afterwards. Like, do they sort of continue to press for like damages for this wrongful destruction of the building? Do they kind of take an assertive Jewish politics? Or do they just like, there's a Ladino word, kayades, which means keep a low profile, quietism, don't make a fuss, keep your head down. And there are big debates in the community as to how to respond to this. So that's, I think, the most common fissure in one, that takes different forms, more than traditional versus modern per se.
Are there any other questions from the Zoom room?
You're able to take a look at it. I can't access it.
What? What are you talking about? Oh, the chat.
The
No,
chat,
I don't
yeah.
see any more in the chat. Unless...
Okay.
I would like to ask a question if you don't mind.
Alina,
Please
okay.
do.
Yes. Hi, Jacob. It's nice to meet you. I also study borders of the Ottoman Empire and in the post-Ottoman period in the Balkans,
Wonderful,
in the Dobruja region. So
wonderful.
I have noticed a trend in historiography when we study borders, we
Yeah,
Ottoman historians, to really focus on the Arab borders more than on the Balkan borders, although I find them even more fascinating
yeah,
and
yeah,
complex. So what is your perception now that you have finished your book project in terms of looking at historiography? What are the trends that you think are so exciting, vibrant, and that complement the study of borderlands in world history at a broader level? And what do you think you have learned from
yeah,
studying your case
yeah.
in terms of engaging with these new trends? So I'm asking you, in other words, about your book, your contribution, the contribution of your book, and I'm grateful for your research. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that question. So on the sort of taking the angle of historiography and the existing literature, so one thing I talk about in the intro, and it actually took me a while, this was something I kind of sensed as I was going about the project, but I couldn't articulate it until the end.
Mm.
There's an interesting disconnect, maybe we should say, between like what most people in the academy just immediately think if you say Borderlands. If you say like Borderlands scholarship, Borderlands theory, most people will immediately think of, right, like in North America and Gloria Anzaldúa and the rich literature that we have on the US, Mexico borderlands and other borderlands in the Western Hemisphere. That's where a lot of, I think, the heavy theorizing has been done. When we talk about, we have like this book, Shattered Zone of Empires, and a few other things that try to sort of set up a theoretical framework for borderlands in the Balkans and that part of the world. But what's interesting, I mean, I think I'd have to go back and look at it. Like even the intro to that book, I don't think there's any attempt to like reconcile or the two literatures or talk about like what are the similarities and differences. It's interesting. Like there's just these two literatures have sort of developed and there's not a lot of talk about like do they have anything in common? Are they completely separate? Like,
Right.
right.
Yeah.
Um, and this is something actually, I mean, I kind of learned this. I'll be perfectly candid. I sort of learned this the hard way in some of my job talks. When I was going, I'm like,
Mhm.
no, I mean, people, I just, it seems so obvious in hindsight, but people in the audience, who are maybe are more coming from like the North American
Yes,
borderlands
it's
are
just simply
we're
not
just coming in,
considering.
well, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
We're just not the focus of attention, I guess.
And I think I was finally able to digest all this and put some of my thoughts down in the intro of this book, where I kind of lay out a Venn diagram of, what do I mean by borderlands
Mhm.
and what is the borderlands literature on the Americas mean and where is their overlap? And I mean the similarities, but especially the differences can be interesting. And for me, an interesting difference is that if Borderlands in the context of the Americas is usually understood to be a place of cultural fluidity, of fluid identities, I should say.
Mhm.
Um, the identities of Edirne Jews are not fluid. Like let me be very clear.
Fixed.
If anything, being in the borderland hardens their identity. Like I said, during these occupations, they gravitate towards Zionism as a
Mhm.
as a hedging strategy, as a neutral, what's seen as a neutral bet. Being in the borderland makes them double down on their Jewish identity because that's seen as a safe bet. Um, so I think there's a lot of work that remains to be done on really theorizing and defining what we mean by borderlands in these other contexts,
Mhm.
and then stepping back and saying, well, okay, so what are we left with? Are there any overlaps? Are there any things in common? I mean, one thing that all borderland studies have in common, and that is important, I think, is decentering the state. I mean, that's something that I think both literatures share, right? That if we just start with the premise that from the start, we're not making this or that state the focus of our study, but a borderland, we are just from the word go, looking at people and places outside of the state paradigm. And I think I'll just quickly say, right, like, I mean, contributions and conclusions. One would be looking at this borderland situation as a factor that shapes Jewish life, and also, I mean, symbolically speaking, Jewish death. In this case, no Jews died, but the death of the community. Sometimes scholars in the field of Jewish history, maybe not so much anymore, but can be quick to say, like, anti-Semitism is the cause of this. I mean, look, were the pogroms against Jews in 1934 anti-Semitic? Of course, but as I write somewhere, anti-Semitism is sort of what is not the explanation. Anti-Semitism is the result. What are the phenomena that cause this? What's the explanation? And for that, I think we have to look towards some of these long-term structural factors that have a lot to do with the borderlands and the nature of the borderlands. So I think that's an approach. Many Jews throughout history lived in borderlands, and scholars of Jewish history might do well to think about how some of these borderland factors affected the outcomes for Jews, broke up Jewish communities that had spanned vast geographic areas and such.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, Christian has a question.
Christian,
Yes, this is our last question.
this is the last question, Christian. Please place your question, and actually, I'd encourage you, Christian. I will tell later, our speaker as well a little bit more, to get in connection with you, because
Yes.
we have an archivist.
No, I think they met.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's here.
We shared a picture of beer, and resulted in me going to Sofia this summer.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Long live Vulcan Circle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
Christian.
actually, I already prepared some rakia. I already prepared some rakia from the
Yeah, be
visit
careful.
in Sofia. So, but I think that
Activities.
I think that he will survive that. I mean, very, very brief questions, actually, two of them. First, congratulations about your talk. It was very, very exciting. Is there any kind of traces Ashkenazi groups in Edirne? First question. I mean, because the majority obviously were Sephardists, but is there any Ashkenazi heritage in Edirne region?
So
And the second one is,
go ahead.
Yeah, this newspaper which you are using in your research, are they digitized and available by internet so far?
Great question. Thank you, Christian.
Sorry, I know that we are run out of.
Pardon? What was the last thing you said?
And also, no, I know that we are run out of time. Sorry
Yeah, I'll be quick.
about
I'll be
questions,
quick.
but
That's all right. I can talk fast. The short answer is no. There's no Ashkenazi synagogue. There's no like Ashkenazi presence in Edirne at this time. Many Sephardi Jews, like to this day, have the last name Eskenazi, which was a giveaway that they have like Ashkenazi Jews somewhere in their lineage, but culturally and in terms of the liturgy and the rite, like the Jewish community of Edirne had become completely Sephardi by this time. Ashkenazi Jews appear sometimes in the context of like Zionist agitators. So that we do see that happening now and then, but there's no Ashkenazi community in Edirne. And I do think for the Jews of Edirne, for the most part, gets a little tricky later, maybe after 1920, but for the most part, when they talk about their Jewish identity and the Jewish nation, they mean the Sephardi or maybe more accurately Ottoman Jewish nation. The Zionists will come to town, some of these agitators, their definition of the Jewish nation is different. When these Ashkenazi Zionists come and give a talk and they say the Jewish nation, they mean world Jewry. But for the Jews of Edirne, when they talk about the Jewish nation, nation, is the Ladino word. They mean Sephardi Ottoman Jewish nation. And the newspaper, La Voz de la Verdad, is held at the National Library of Israel as a PDF. And I'm not sure if you can just download it. You might have to contact someone. I ended up contacting a librarian and getting a PDF of it. So yes, there's a PDF at the National Library of Israel.
Okay, well, that concludes our Balkan Circle today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so I hope everyone will go buy the book, which is not quite out yet, but it's already on Amazon. I'm gonna
Mhm.
post that link, even though, sorry, I don't support Amazon. If you can get it somewhere else, that's
Stanford
fine
University,
too.
you can get a
There you
straight from
go.
Stanford
Direct.
University.
Buy
from
it
the
directly
press.
from Stanford
And you
University.
can, I can give you a discount code.
There you go.
Just reach out to me.
Yeah, so the book's called Jews of Edirne, The End of the Ottoman Europe and Arrival of Borders. It's a fantastic title. It's fantastic research. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Mulțumesc. Благодаря. Uh,
Bye bye.
so,
Bye.
Ciao.
ciao, ciao. Благодаря ви много.